Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. Well, Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. It's a city full of art, culture, and history. And much of that history has been preserved, and some of it has not been preserved. There are things that we thought were there that are no longer there. And that brings me to my two guests who are joining us on this edition of the Philly Factor. Natalie and her sister. Her sister is, I should know this, her sister's name is...
Tricia.
Thank you. I'm looking at my notes here and it's like, I should have known that. It's Pompilio, correct?
Yes.
Okay. They live in Queens Village. They are the author of a book that sort of gets to the root of what we're going to be talking about here for the next half hour. The title of the book is This Used to Be Philadelphia. It comes after their 2017 book collaboration, Walking Philadelphia, 30 walking tours featuring art, architecture, history, and little-known gems. And I'd like to welcome you both to our program.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks.
So the success of your first book in 2017 sort of caused the second book to come on the radar screen. And I have to ask, the fact that you're sisters, does that help you in your collaboration, or does that hinder you or challenge you in your collaboration?
Well, our jobs are so different in these books. Like, I do all the writing and researching, and she does all the photos. So we're not running into each other.
Yeah.
The most I got yelled at during this book because I had to drive her around to take photos. And I was always being yelled to move the car or, pick me up somewhere else. But
yeah, we have very different skill set. So I think we complement each other because I do not enjoy writing at all. And she does not enjoy taking photos. So we don't try to step on each other's toes.
Right.
Nothing to do.
Stay in your own lane, right?
Yeah.
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 So being a lifelong South Philadelphia resident, myself, I mean, there are things that growing up used to be there. Now, all of a sudden, they're no longer there. But one thing that I found in your book is that there are many aha moments that I experienced because I had heard stories or legends about, let's say, the Moy-Mensing prison. I remember my father talking about the Moy-Mensing prison. But if you were to go where the Moy-Mensing prison was once located, Natalie, there's an Acme there now, right?
Correct. And that's the Acme I usually shop at. And it's interesting because not only was it a prison and a very significant prison, but it's where America's first serial killer was put to death. So every time I'm in the store, I'm in the produce section, I'm in the milk section, like, where was the gallows? H.H. Holmes died here. And it's kind of creepy.
Yeah. Now, is there an historical marker there? We're talking about the area of 10th and Dickinson, if my memory serves me correct. But is there the city, besides being full of, art, culture, history, there are these blue markers that have popped up all around the city that sort of mark some of these locations. So is there one there at 10th and Dickinson that sort of indicates this is where the prison was?
There is one. I'm a big fan of the historic marker program. I encourage everybody to stop and read them. And then, you get a hint of information, and then you'll go down hours of rabbit holes of reading about some cool places. Yeah.
This book not only encompasses South Philadelphia, but it really encompasses many parts of the city. I mean, it's pretty much right across the city. So when, Natalie, you're the writer, you were writing entertainment columns for newspapers, and then the pandemic hit. And so that sort of helped you, I guess, in your mission to write this book. But I mean, where do you set out? Where do you begin? Because, as I said, Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods, and regardless of where you turn or where you go, there's either lore or legend or people telling you, well, this was here at one time and now it's not. So where do you begin this journey?
Doing our first book introduced me to a lot of places that I could include, and I wanted to include, like Moy-Mensing Prison. That's one of my favorite stories in the book. And I like talking about the Rite Aid where Palumbo's Cabaret was, because that's my Rite Aid, So I started in my world and just expanded. And what drives me crazy now is every day I see more places I could have put in. And I think this will keep happening, throughout the years. I keep asking, like, why didn't I put in the Armory? Why didn't I put in the Squash Center at Drexel? These places are always coming up. So there's always a need for the book. And I was not very precise in how I went about it. It was more like, oh, that interests me. Let me follow up. But it was endless opportunities. So I wish there was a formula I could tell you, but it was more like, oh, that's cool. Let me read about that.
Sure. And then I guess the challenge is to your sister. Since some of these places don't exist like they did back then, how do you go about photographing these areas? I mean, you could take a picture of the Acme at 10th and Dickinson, not to belabor the point of the 10th and Dickinson Acme, but you could go and take a picture of the Acme, but it doesn't necessarily show the prison itself. So how do you capture these areas when, in many cases, these places don't exist any longer?
So that was part of what we talked about as we were even driving around. Like, she would take me to a certain location. I'd be like, this is not something we want to use. Like, this is not going to show us anything. There's not a picture of the Acme, because I'm like, it's just a grocery store. So Natalie did a lot of research and finding some stock photos of all the locations, when they were back then. So you'll notice throughout the book, there are photos that I took that are new, and there are a lot of old pictures mixed in, because Philly's, I said this when we did the other book as well, like, it's not always easy to capture it because there's always construction happening. There's always it's always changing, and there's always something to make a photo not as appealing to me as a photographer. So I always do my best, but if I felt like, I feel like this is not going to show well in the book. And so she did a lot of research and pulled up images from the library, and we just use those instead. Because I think having those is, in a lot of cases, much better than even showing what's there now.
Sure.
So,
the first book that you wrote in 2017, Walking Philadelphia, did that? Were you able to use that in some regards as a roadmap or a guide when Reedy Press came to you and said, "Hey, we have this idea for another book"? Were you able to go back to some of those other things that you included in your first book as maybe a launching pad for inclusion in this new book?
Completely. It was very useful. And that's really what got me excited when Reedy approached me. I'm like, oh, I've already started doing this. I have so much stuff I haven't used in the other book. Because, this book is like a walking book. It's not as detailed. I can't tell the longer stories. But there were a couple places in here that I remembered that I got to put in here. And we always get back to Moya Mensing Prison. That was one of them. I got to get the prison in.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of those locations that you include in your book that may have been very eye-opening for the two of you. I mean, there are so many great stories and photos in the book, but being from South Philadelphia and from the Queen Village neighborhood of Philadelphia, you tend to be a little more in tune with things that are in your own community. But then when you sort of come out of that comfort zone and you may go to West Philly or North Philly or Kensington or wherever, and then you sort of experience and find these hidden gems, what were some of them that were eye-opening experiences for the two of you?
One that I love is that the Boyd's, the high-end retail store, was a funeral home, a very nice funeral home, the Bear Funeral Home. And I noticed the other day that when I was walking down Sansom, because you don't know from, you go by the store, looks just Boyd's. But on the back, it still has BAIR engraved on the building. So that was pretty exciting. So that guy, when he built this funeral home, he just wanted it to be a place where everybody could afford a beautiful funeral. He started a payment plan, and it was supposed to be that's why it's set up like such a palace. So no matter what money you had, you'd feel special when you came in. And I really love that. And, you know, in my own personal family history, when I think about, you know, walking Philadelphia, Natalie's life, that's where our dad got his wedding suit for my wedding. So you can include it right there.
Yeah. The book is dedicated to your dad, who passed away in 2020. And, you know, it just harkens back to sometimes these great resources that we have, even in our own family. They tell us these stories. As I said, you know, in the beginning, my father always talked about, not that he was incarcerated at the Moy-Mensing prison, but he would always bring up the Moy-Mensing prison for whatever reason. And I was like, you know, what are you talking about, Moy-Mensing prison? Because when you're a young kid in South Philadelphia, you don't necessarily think of a prison being in your neighborhood. It's like some, you know, stone gated building that is, you know, somewhere else. But, you know, even our own family have, you know, our family members have these stories, these tales, these, you know, legends of places that are no longer there. And sometimes we don't necessarily pay that much attention to them when they're talking about it until it's too late and say, gee, I wish my mother or my father or my uncle were still here to tell me about such and such a place. I mean, I just read an article the other day about Marconi Plaza. I mean, I grew up, you know, playing in Marconi Plaza and didn't realize the historic significance of Marconi Plaza besides being a park. It was a Native American and, you know, slave encampment, from what I read in the paper back in the day. Never realized that.
I had no idea. When we were doing this book, a friend who is a native Philadelphian said, well, that makes a lot of sense, because people in Philadelphia don't let places go, and they still give directions based on what used to be there.
Yeah.
So like an example, we were talking about the Bonwit Teller, which, you know, I think now it might be a Nordstrom, but, you know, where Rocky pulls in during like the second movie and he buys his crazy jacket. Like, you know, people will give directions saying, turn left at the Bonwit Teller. People are like, what are you talking about? Like, that hasn't existed in decades.
Yeah. And you mentioned Rocky. I mean, he gets married at St. Thomas Aquinas Church in South Philadelphia. And sometimes, you know, how many times people drive through that part of South Philadelphia and don't realize that that's the church where Rocky gets married. And there was a scene shot right in the parking lot there with the priest hanging out the window of the rectory. You know, that's what I find fascinating. It's that these hidden gems that I hope, and I think your book goes a long way to sort of capturing these moments and preserving them. It's a snapshot in time, because I think with every year that passes and every decade that passes, we tend to lose sight of these landmarks, and it's unfortunate. But you know, some of them are, as I said, still visible to us, and in some cases, you know, urban renewal has claimed many of these properties as well.
Well, you know, we see that going on in Jewelers Row. The debate over building those high rises there, and the old buildings got torn down.
Sure. Trish, when you're out and about, and whether it's you're picking your son up from school or just walking out the front door, do you always have that photographer's eye when you're looking up and down the street, at the corner, across the street, around, you know, wherever it is you're going? You have that photographer's eye. You see something that makes for an interesting photograph, and that doesn't necessarily resonate with neighbors, or people just don't seem to care or pay attention to what that marker on that building might mean.
Yeah, I think more and more I'm becoming that way, because I'm mostly a photographer of people. I do families and children and headshots and that type of photo. So this photography in this book is very different for me. So it's almost like I had to learn a new skill, because taking photos of buildings and landmarks is very different from people as your main subject, believe it or not. Mm. And a lot of it is, you know, perspective and trying to make things look interesting from different angles, and making sure what's the same, it's always the same, is if the light is right. So we drive around and I'd be like, I can't take this photo right now. We need to come out at 6 o'clock in the morning, because I need the sun to be hitting this building the right way. It's so beautiful that I can't ruin it You know, I need to really, or I need to go a magic hour at 6 p.m. in the summer, whenever that time was, when the light was just hitting it right. So that always stays the same. But this book, and then even reading my sister who did all the research, really does open my eyes to pay more attention to those buildings and incorporate them into my photography with people. So these buildings are so beautiful. There's so many different styles. You have the Greek, Art Deco, Gothic, like you can take advantage of all those different backgrounds and interesting colors and shapes, incorporate them into my normal photos, my typical photos. So yeah, I definitely notice buildings more now, for sure, and the way the light's hitting them, and I can put a family here. This will look beautiful, and the steps coming down and the columns. So yeah, for sure.
Is it, I mean, is it easier to photograph buildings like Independence Hall? I mean, it's probably one of the most iconic buildings in Philadelphia, and perhaps one of the most photographed buildings in Philadelphia. And say, well, is there an angle, or is there a way to photograph Independence Hall that's going to make it look completely different than any other photo of Independence Hall in a history book? And you mentioned the lighting and and the sun and the shading and all that, but and then there are the iconic Rocky steps. I mean, they're art museum steps. I mean, are there, again, one of those iconic backdrops in Philadelphia that has been photographed probably thousands of times. But is there a way to tell a story by taking a photo of the art museum steps that perhaps hasn't been captured before?
Yeah, I've noticed it even changed the way I shoot people, because when I went to, for instance, the Ray Street Pier, I typically would go on it with people and go all the way to the end, and I'd sort of shoot the Ben Franklin Bridge in the background and sort of frame them. I actually did Natalie's headshot over there. Mm-hmm. But then when I was trying to photograph for the book, and I'm like, this is not working. So I backed up all the way to the end and sort of it framed it. It's one of the colored photos in the book, one of the large photos that way. I'm like, this is a whole different perspective. This is actually showing it in all its glory. Showing the bridge, showing the trees, the way the lines lead up to the water, the pier itself. So I think it's the best thing to do in taking photos of buildings and trying to make them look interesting is move. I move my feet constantly. I'm running to one corner, and then Natalie, I'm like, drive me over here or meet me over there and move your car. It's in my shot. So that actually happened. And it's a learning for me too. Just everything looks different. Just from a different angle, or getting closer, getting further away, and then coming home and saying, oh, wow, I love the way this sort of worked. Let me try this for the next building. So I don't know, it's always the same for every place. It's different. Like some buildings are better off shooting a little bit of detail. This ornate door. This is what's working. When I shoot wide, there's just too much distraction in the photo. So every location's different. It depends on the time of day, the amount of people, what's going on. But I always suggest, like, if you're trying to get an interesting photo of the environment, just do different things. Go look at your camera when you get home and say, okay, now I'm going to try it a different way at a different time of day and see if I like that better.
Natalie, when you decided, and earlier in the program, you mentioned that there are so many places that you had to pick and choose what you could include in the book and what you couldn't include in the book. I'm hoping that there might be books 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, not to put any pressure on you. But when you decide what you're going to include, was it difficult to then try to track down information on these buildings? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to include the Moy-Mensing prison, but then where do you go and find information about the notorious, killing that or execution that happened there? I mean, where do you go for that information?
Well, especially during a pandemic when you can't go anywhere.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
I relied on newspapers.com a lot. I love it. I fell into so many rabbit holes about, I got someone's name. This person owned this building. Well, now I'm going to search them on newspapers.com and read everything I can until I can find something interesting to say about them. It's in there. I mean, and there's one mill in the book that I was really into, but then I was like, oh, this family's boring me. Like, nothing interesting But then I found an article when they were complaining about a tariff that President McKinley was putting into place, and it just made it more, oh yeah, that was a different time, different place, this was happening. And so I included that fact. I did so much reading for and writing and work researching that it's, you know, if I had to figure out, I probably made like a quarter an hour because I've done so much for this book. But it was fun, and like, you know, hours would pass and I was like, I can't believe I just read every article, you know, about this mill, and I haven't written anything yet.
Yeah. What is it that you hope people who get the book, what do you hope they come away with? I mean, on the surface, it would seem to me that they come away with an appreciation of parts of the city that are no longer there. I mean, even in my own lifetime, you know, there was the Colonial Theater where, you know, as a kid, we would go and see movies. And then there was the Broadway Theater on Broad Street where we would go and, you know, watch movies. But what is it that you hope that people take away from your book?
Well, I don't want to sound as old as I am, but I am getting that old crotchety self that I'm like, look around. Everything looks cool. Get off your phone. Look at the architecture. You know, walking down Chestnut Street between like 15th and 17th. Wait, why does the Foot Locker have that weird marquee? Why does the Five Below look like that? Oh, they used to be theaters. Oh, Grace Kelly had a movie premiere here. It's so much more interesting when you know these facts. I was innocently walking around, well, these other people were tourists, and they were at the William White House, and there's like, are you lost? They said, no, we're not lost. And I'm like, oh, well, you know, this guy, he was a really good reverend, and during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, he tended people, and he didn't get sick because he smoked so many smelly cigars. And they're like, thank you for that fact, ma'am. And I like ran away happily, but I was like, yeah, things are interesting. I'm nosy, journalist. I like reading these things.
We have just a few minutes left here, and I have to ask this question because I don't know if you've realized this, but the two of you are important for so many reasons. I mean, you've documented these places and these buildings and these locations in your book, but you also are part now of documenting history in Philadelphia. I mean, you're not going to find some of the locations in your, you know, the locations are in your book, you're not going to find in a high school history textbook. You're just not going to find it, whether it's on Philadelphia history or not. But you, two of you, are responsible for documenting the history of Philadelphia. How does that make you feel?
Well, I wrote about this. It makes me very excited to think where I live in Queen Village, that people, Italian men getting off the ship at Washington Avenue with a note pinned on their chest saying Palumbo's, walked by my house. And I'm wondering, you know, what will my footsteps be later? Will they be in some book? Maybe not with my name, but, you know, what impact are we having on the city? I do think about it.
Yeah, and I think we both chose to live here, both from New Jersey, more central North Jersey, and we both picked to live here, and we've stayed here. So we've fallen in love with the city, and I'm raising my 3 girls here, and I'm proud of the city. I mean, it's not perfect, nowhere is, but overall, I think it's just a wonderful place to live and to raise my family. And I'm proud that we take pride in what's here, and we take advantage of all the city that it has to offer. We take our children, her nieces, to all these museums and buildings, and we can teach them about life and what happened before and all this history. And reading Natalie's words, like, you could just learn. It's so interesting. It's like taking a history class, but in a really great, interesting way. And just walking around seeing all this, it makes me proud also to be a part of something like this.
Yeah, you touched on a very important point because I don't know, I kiddingly say I'm the oldest person in the room, but I am the oldest person in the room. History, when I was sitting in a grade school in South Philadelphia learning history, it's much different than learning history today. And oftentimes people sort of contain history in a book or in a box, but all you have to do is step outside on any street corner in Philadelphia, and there is history all around you. I mean, that's history. Yeah, it's great to learn, what happened in 1775 and 1776 and where this battle was and what happened there. But all you have to do is just step out your front door, and we are fortunate enough to be surrounded by so much history.
Yeah, and I live across the street, literally from the Shot Tower Rec Center now, but that's where my kids play. Mm-hmm. And that we have we also, I volunteered for the Friends group there, and we have a sign out the front telling about the history of the Shot Tower, and so now everyone could read about it, and it's just great to be a part of all that.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time, and we could go on for another hour or two, and I want to thank both of you for being with us here on this program. And I encourage people to pick up the book. It's a great book, especially now for the holidays. People could go out and pick up the book. And it's available in bookstores. It's available on Amazon.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, you should tell really quick, Natalie has been working diligently to put a new edition of Walking Philadelphia. Okay. And she's been working so hard that I thought, are you rewriting this book? I mean, really putting time into it. So that will be coming out, I think, I don't know when exactly. Early next year. But yes.
Well, we'll have to have you back on and talk about that book, because we really didn't talk about that book. So we'll have you back on when the book is released next year to be with us on the program.
But yes, ladies, you can buy the book anywhere. It's in all the bookstores.
All the local stores. Yeah.
It's Amazon. Call me. I probably have copies. I'll sign for free.
Well, I want to thank you both. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And we'll talk again soon. And I want to thank you both for being with us. Until the next time, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us on this edition of the Philly Factor.